Hello and welcome to Science Unscripted. It's Conor here, and I'm on my own today. Gabe is not in the chair next to me. He is, actually, he's out of the country right now, and I will let him explain why next week. But for this episode, it's just me. I'm going to start off with a couple of emails, the first of which comes from inside Canada's national parliament, I believe. So this is from somebody who works there and said or wrote, "To Gabe and Conor, yours is a must-listen broadcast for me via the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Here in the national capital, some effort is required because the time slot is 4:30 a.m. on Sunday mornings." That is, roughly when we're played. I do think it depends on where you live. Kind of an early time slot for us, but one that I do think fits this particular program. Many thanks for the thought-provoking series, and many thanks to you, our listener, sitting somewhere in Canada's Parliament. This next one here is in connection to, or in reference to, a study that we talked about with regard to keeping score, keeping track, keeping a mental ledger in your head about what you've done and your partner hasn't. So if I've done something around the house, or I've given a gift, or I've gone out of my way to do something for my partner or for the relationship, then if I expect something in return, if I'm keeping a mental list of all those things that I have done, then you can expect the quality of the relationship to decline over time. And we have a nice email in response to that from Jenny, who said, "One of the things that my husband and I do that I think may help with this is that we ask each other for help on a pretty regular basis with tasks that we need to do, and we make a point to help our partner out if we can when we're asked. We remember that we are partners in life and not just spouses in this way, and will often, quote-unquote, celebrate our partnership when tasks are completed by thanking the other person, or, if it was a bigger task, with a high five and a, quote, 'We make a good team.' In my first marriage, I would avoid asking for help and then would silently resent it when I never got help, and that marriage ended in divorce. I've learned how to be willing to ask and never assume that the other person can read my mind." First of all, Jenny, I think everyone has felt that resentment or frustration at some point in a long-term relationship. Secondly, very good or kudos, tap on your back for acknowledging it and being aware that that could have been one part of the problem in a relationship that did fail. I think a lot of people like to imagine, that when a relationship fails, it's always entirely the other person's fault. And it's harder to acknowledge that you may have done something wrong as well. Final email here. "Hello, Conor and Gabe. My partner and I are in our 31st year unmarried. How do we do it? At the turn of each solstice and then equinox, we ask, 'Do you still want to do this?' So far, the answer has always been yes, at which point we spit on our hand, shake the other's hand firmly, then have a laugh, perhaps a drink. But if the answer would ever be no, we are equally committed to walking away, again with a laugh, and most certainly a drink in celebration of our great fortune at having shared the time we have had together." That one comes from P and Y. I assume those are the first letters of each of their names. And I don't know why this is what jumps out at me about that email, but it's the fact that you do this on each solstice, so the summer and winter solstice, the longest day and the shortest day of the year, and then the two equinoxes, so where in spring and in fall or autumn, where the day is about as long as the night. I always like when people kind of line up things with the seasons in that way, or with the natural phases of the earth. So P and Y, I like what you're doing, and here's to hopefully another 31 more years for you. Okay, so I think most of our listeners have heard us talk recently on the show about political polarization, and typically we have connected that to social media. The idea that you are probably, if you're active on social media, you're probably in some form of a bubble where you are connected with or receiving information, updates, posts from people who are somewhat like-minded, people who are politically more aligned with you than the people who are outside that bubble. And that also is true for some of the media, the news media that you consume. We've talked about this on the show, and what we're going to talk about now is some research that kind of goes back to the origins of why we do that. Because if you're tempted, like I am sometimes, to blame social media companies, many of them in Silicon Valley in the United States, for polarizing all of us by putting us in these bubbles, new research suggests not only that we ourselves choose to do that, but there is a very specific age when we begin.
Science Unscripted.
All right. Hello. My name is Radhika Santhanagopalan. I am a researcher. I study decision-making in young children. And we recently published a paper in Psychological Science on the development of information avoidance.
Radhika, what is the primary conclusion, would you say, of your study on children avoiding information?
So our primary takeaway is that in general, children seem to really be highly curious. They really want to learn new information, but that with age, children start to avoid useful, potentially relevant information in their day-to-day lives.
How young are they exactly when they start deciding not to seek out some information?
Yeah, our age range was 5 to 10 years old, and we saw this evidence of avoidance at around age 7.
So up to age 7, I don't know, 5, 6, and possibly earlier, the kids are doing what exactly? They're seeking out any information no matter what because they're just super curious?
Something like that, yeah. They tend to have pretty high baseline curiosity, so they just want to kind of indulge in as much information as they can. For anyone who's interacted with children, you might notice this, yourselves, that children are just highly curious and want to learn as much as possible, even when it might come at the cost of their emotional state.
And then at roughly, or on average, age 7, what happens exactly there? What do they start doing or stop doing?
There are a couple of things that we think might be going on. One in particular that we tested is that with age, children seem to be better anticipators of how information might make them feel. So they might just be better at anticipating that, hey, this information might make me feel not particularly great, and so I'm going to avoid this information. Whereas maybe younger children don't quite have that capacity to think about their future emotional states, or they might have like an optimism bias where they think the information is just going to be great regardless, even if it's, proposed as being potentially negative.
I'm just going to try to imagine what some of the negative information could be. I could imagine a kid finding out that they have to go take a nap, and so they would not want to find that out, or they might, want a candy or a cookie, and so they don't want to learn that they can't eat that thing. But how did you actually do the experiment? What kind of information did they have to confront?
Yeah, we presented them with several scenarios that we thought might elicit avoidance across different domains of knowledge. So kind of similar to your candy example, children could learn why their favorite candy was bad for them. And in another scenario, they could learn why their least favorite candy was bad for them, in which case we would not expect children to avoid that information because, they don't like that candy anyway. But for the candy they do like, we might expect that they would not want to learn why their favorite candy is bad for them. Similarly, you might want to not want to know if you did really badly on a test in school. You might not want to know if a birthday kid didn't want to invite you to a birthday party. That might not make you feel particularly good. You might not want to know information that challenges your beliefs. Say you believe really strongly about something. You might not want to hear why someone disagrees with something you strongly believe in.
So all of these were things that kids in your experiment could have learned. They could have found out about this, and yet on some level they decided not to. What, you were telling them, hey, do you want to find out about this birthday party? And they were saying no?
Yeah, so they were saying, for example, they were more likely to say they wanted to avoid learning if they were the one who wasn't invited to a birthday party. Then it's equivalent. Like we told them, for example, imagine now you were definitely invited to this birthday party. Do you want to know who wasn't invited? In which case children were less likely to avoid information in those scenarios. That's right. But I will say overall, children were generally curious at baseline. It's just that older children were more likely to exhibit these avoidance tendencies than younger children.
And does that get stronger the older they get, or is it kind of like a flip switches at age 7 and it just now there's like a new baseline for how we consume information that is going to affect us negatively?
I would say it's a little more gradual than that. From the data, we can't get quite at that level of granularity, but I would say that it's probably more gradual, and there's probably a lot of individual differences, even among kids that are, say, 7, where some are maybe, say, better anticipators of their future emotional state, and others are less so. So yeah, I would say it's somewhat gradual.
So this switch flips in our brains. We decide to avoid information that's going to induce negative feelings, anxiety, frustration, whatever, and then it never really goes back.
There's probably individual differences here, but yeah, the idea is that, as adults, and I'm sure maybe you and your listeners might experience this yourselves, there are many situations in which you may realize that you are avoiding this information, whether that's like getting a medical test or learning negative information about a political candidate that you like, things like that. So I think, yes, we do it a lot as adults, and kids less so. And so they're kind of a remarkable example of how maybe we should look to them as role models for this particular domain.
This seems like a negative thing. That was my first reaction. This is bad, right? We are avoiding information, and information is always useful, and we should always get as much as we can. My question is this bad, though? Is this a form of, like, a healthy way to protect some part of ourselves? Because otherwise, why would we do it?
Yeah. I mean, certainly information avoidance can be both normal and very adaptive. It can help both children and adults, protect themselves from overwhelming emotion or threatening information. So certainly those cases exist. At the same time, there's always a dark side to anything one studies, right? So there are situations in which it's extremely important to obtain information, but we still opt not to. And it's those situations that we're especially intrigued by, because these are these fascinating human tendencies to engage in these very maladaptive patterns of behaviors that can end up with them making worse decisions in the long run.
A lot of people are familiar with the idea that social media bubbles, or being connected to people who think similarly to the way I do and have similar political opinions, that increases political polarization and may be, the cause for a lot of political problems that are happening today. Is it more fair to say, based on your research, that those social media bubbles are kind of inevitable? We really do, from age 7 onwards, want to be in them?
Yeah, I think it's a human capacity to want to be around people that like us and agree with us and, validate our opinions. And I think more credit needs to be given to humans in this. And humans are the ones who kind of opt into certain spaces. And so there's some level of, we kind of know we're doing this. So I don't think it's particularly fair to, blame necessarily, an external non-agentic a platform necessarily. I do think there's a lot we can do as humans to try to, have more crosstalk and more dialogue across these different groups. I'm not trying to say, like, don't be part of any group. That's certainly not adaptive either. But I do think recognizing these echo chambers and recognizing how information that you are exposed to might be extremely skewed and even distorted is one way to try to be more deliberative about what information you're getting, and being better about seeking information that you may otherwise not necessarily engage with.
And that was Radhika Santhanagopoulan talking to us from the University of Chicago, where she conducted that study on about 300 children. I think I'll just finish up here by acknowledging one of my information avoidance tactics. I was trying to think about that when I was talking to her. What is something that I do avoid? And it's connected to this show, because Gabe and I, when he's here, we come into the office and we go through the emails that our listeners around the world send to us. And some of those emails are painful because they criticize us for things we did or things we didn't do. And the temptation is to either not read the email at all or skim them. Gabe and I force ourselves to read them. And so I would say that's a kind of a positive example of us choosing not to avoid that painful information. Do you avoid painful information? If so, what kind? I think this is one of those issues that we're probably not as aware of ourselves doing it as we maybe should be, but maybe you're that kind of person. Maybe you're aware. In any case, let us know with a pleasant or painful email to su@dw.com. If a lot of you out there use your phone the way I use my phone, and that's to say sometimes you're really tired and it's late at night and you just look at kind of stupid videos for a while because you're tired, inevitably you'll come across one. The most recent one I can remember watching was a guy walking up onto the roof of a house, and he picks up, I think, his girlfriend or a girlfriend, and holding her, he backflips off the roof of the house into a swimming pool and barely avoids breaking his own neck and possibly her neck and ending up severely crippled for the rest of his life. And inevitably, in the comment section of a video like that, there's a comment that says, "This is why men don't live as long as women." They do really stupid stuff like that. Really stupid stuff. They jump off of roofs. They drive too fast. They engage in really risky behavior that has very few rewards, if you really think about it, and hence their lives are shorter. Well, one way to get at whether or not that's true or mostly true or kind of true is to look at a huge swath of the animal kingdom and see if, when you look at all of those animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, and more, do females always live longer than males?
Science Unscripted.
Hi, my name is Johanna Stärk. I'm an evolutionary biologist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and together with 15 co-authors worldwide, we conducted a study on one of biology's long-standing puzzles, which is why males and females age differently.
Why do we have different lifespans, Johanna? Why do men not live as long as women do?
Yes, that's a good question, and it has been debated for a long time. In humans, it's really interesting because the female lifespan advantage is one of the most robust patterns that we have observed, with an average of about 5 years that women live longer than men. And we were interested if this pattern can also be seen across the tree of life.
Meaning that if it's obviously true with Homo sapiens, everywhere you look, every pocket of the globe, women live longer than men, and so hence there would be some logic in that being true kind of everywhere for animals, right?
Yes, of course, in biology, usually the answer is not as clear-cut. We often have a lot of diversity, so also in humans, the magnitude, for example, of the sex difference can vary considerably between populations.
And so is it true with animals? Do female animals always live longer than the males?
Well, so we looked at more than 1,200 species of mammals and birds. And what we found is that among mammals, females generally live longer, so like in humans. In about 72% of species, we found a female life expectancy advantage, averaging about 12% longer lives for females. But then what's so surprising is when we look at birds, we found the reverse. So here, in about 2/3 of them, males outlive females with an average of 5% male advantage.
The birds kind of surprises me because one thing that I've always found interesting about birds is it's usually the males that are really colorful. I think the peacock is the best example of that. Huge plumage. I mean, you're going to notice them, and that's also true if you're a predator. You're going to see that guy because he's bright green and blue and possibly reds mixed in there. And so that, to me, that seems like a reason that male birds should live not as long. And yet you're saying that they live 5% longer.
True. Well, other factors also play a role. For example, genetics. This is one of the hypotheses that we investigated, called the heterogametic sex hypothesis. And here birds are interesting because in mammals, the heterogametic sex is males, so they have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. And in birds, it's reversed. So here the males have basically two chromosomes that are the same.
I've heard the chromosome discussion with humans in reference to why women live longer, and it's connected to the idea that women have two X chromosomes and we men have an XY. Can you explain why that would make my life shorter, having a Y instead of an X?
Yes, so some research suggests that having two X chromosomes can protect females from harmful mutations, given that they have two copies of the same allele. So for example, if you have a mutation on one allele, you still have another one that can compensate for that harmful mutation. And males don't have that, so they only have one allele on the X chromosome and no compensating allele on the Y chromosome, because the Y chromosome is very small and only carries very few genes.
And in birds, the opposite is true. The males have kind of the backup chromosome. They have it twice, so in case there's a mutation, they're still okay. They would still live longer in that case.
Yes, simply speaking, yes.
So is that enough to say, to explain the whole gap in longevity between, not necessarily males and females, but whichever biological sex has a backup copy of that chromosome, whatever it is, that they're probably going to live longer? Is it as simple as that?
No, of course not, because otherwise we would see that in all mammals, females live longer because they share the same sex determination system. And in all birds, the males would live longer. But that's not the case. We see a lot of diversity and also many exceptions to that rule. So it's likely an interplay between, genetics, environments, but then also sexual selection pressures and parental care patterns.
So let's go to the mammals. Again, we've got roughly 3 out of 4 mammals are like us humans. The female is going to live longer, but in a quarter of the cases, it's the other way around. What is going on there?
So another hypothesis that we investigated relates to sexual selection trade-offs. So what you just mentioned, for example, the peacock, you invest in a very bright plumage. So that increases your reproductive success, but it can also reduce your survival. And we found that in mammals that have a polygynous mating system, so where a male competes for access to multiple females and grow, for example, large bodies and weapons, that reduces their chances of survival.
Oh, right. Yeah, they're gonna kill each other, the males, right? They're gonna run at each other with antlers and claw each other to death and bite each other to death.
Yeah, exactly. An example would be lions, where they have to monopolize several females and they have to defend them against other lions. And they have big manes, so that's costly.
When I met my now wife, I don't remember fighting another male for her or running at him with my my fingernails bared and clawing at him and winning that battle and hence winning my then girlfriend and now wife. So am I right to assume that men aren't living shorter lives because of that kind of polygamy, right?
No. So in humans, historically, sexual selection was probably weaker than in other apes. This is also possibly related to our mating system. So for example, chimpanzees and gorillas, they are highly non-monogamous. And humans fall probably more somewhere, in between monogamy and non-monogamy. But of course, social and cultural factors also play a much greater role in humans.
One part of your study that was very surprising to me, very counterintuitive. I think any parent out there may be able to relate to this. It's that child rearing, raising a baby into adulthood, that whole process doesn't shorten your life, but instead actually, it possibly extends it?
Yeah, we were really surprised by that because generally in evolutionary theory, we would expect a trade-off between producing offspring and surviving. So the more offspring you have, the more eggs you lay, the shorter you live. So on the contrary, we found that species with a lot of parental care, the sex that cares more also lives longer.
The parent that takes more care of the young lives longer in most species?
Well, one competing hypothesis that has been proposed is that in long-lived species, such as primates, the caregiving sex lives longer because it could be a selective advantage, because the caregiving sex needs to survive long enough to raise their offspring to maturity and potentially even their grand offspring.
Right. So the one who doesn't take care of the child, if they go off somewhere in the forest and die, that doesn't matter. But the one who cares for the child from an evolutionary perspective needs to live longer so they can keep doing that until they're entirely on their own.
Yeah, exactly. And if your offspring needs 14, 15 years to mature, you have to make sure you actually survive that long to be able to raise it so that your offspring can also produce offspring.
What can we say as a result of your research looking at more than 1,000 different animals from mammals to birds to reptiles? What does that tell us, about ourselves? What can you say now that you couldn't say before about why women live longer than men?
This pattern that females live longer than males is not unique to humans, but it's also not a universal law. The patterns are likely a product of different factors, including chromosomes, hormones, competition, parental care, and also chance. So, yeah, this hints that this lifespan gap that we see in humans is likely not going to disappear very soon in the future.
Is there anything that could make it disappear?
On average, I think women are going to live longer than men, but of course, this is a distribution, right? So there are many men who outlive women and the other way around. So lifestyle choices also play a huge role. So, not taking part in risky behavior and eating healthy and so on will make you live longer. But a long life doesn't necessarily mean a better quality of life. So what has been found is that although women live longer almost everywhere, they often spend more years in poor health compared to men. So they often show more autoimmune disease, dementia, or other chronic conditions. So this kind of female advantage may also come at a cost.
And that was Johanna Stärk from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, which is based in Leipzig, but she was actually kind enough to be talking to us there from her parents' place down in Mainz, Germany. She was on vacation, took some time out of her vacation to talk to me. Thank you again for that, Johanna. Pretty clear message for all of us, for all of the men out there who have listened to this and who have been reminded that they're not going to live, on average, as long as women. One thing you can do to potentially change that is relatively easy, one critique that's often aimed at us men, and I think it's definitely true with me, is go to the doctor more often if you can afford to. If you're living in a country where it's affordable, go. I say this as somebody because I'm from the United States and it always cost me money to go to the doctor, and I didn't want to spend my money when I didn't have to. I didn't go. And so even in Germany, where going to the general practitioner is free, I don't go nearly as often as I should. I'm trying to be better at that, and that's my advice to everyone out there. Do you have anything else to say on men living shorter lives than women or women living longer lives than men? Please let us know, su@dw.com.